My sister accused me of stealing attention by getting pregnant after 3 years of IVF, but when she showed up at my house at night with a knife threatening my baby, I had to flee the state, and she ended up arrested. I'm 33 years old, I work in office administration, and after 3 years of fertility treatments that basically left me emotionally and financially drained, I finally got pregnant. It should have been the happiest moment of my life. You know, after so long trying, so many disappointments, so many injections and doctor's appointments, and crying in the bathroom when another month came without results. But what should have been pure joy turned into an absolute nightmare because of my younger sister, Amber, who basically destroyed any possibility of our family continuing to be a family. I guess I should start from the beginning so this makes sense. I grew up being the older sister, the responsible one, the one who always tried to keep the peace in the family. Amber is 29 years old, so 4 years younger than me. And since we were kids, she was always the one who needed to be the center of attention. I don't know if it was because she was born later and felt like she had to compete with me, or what. But my parents, Kenneth and Sharon, never really set boundaries for her. If Amber threw a tantrum, they'd give in. If I complained about something she'd done, they'd tell me to be the big sister and understand her. Looking back, I should have seen coming what would happen. But you always want to believe that family is family. You know what I mean? My husband Gregory and I had been married for about 5 years when we decided we wanted to have kids. We thought it would be easy. We'd just try, and it would happen. But after a year without results, we went to the doctor, and they told us I had some fertility issues. I'm not going to get into all the medical details because they're complicated and frankly depressing, but basically we needed to do IVF if we wanted to have a biological baby. The process was brutal, honestly. 3 years of daily injections, hormones that made me feel crazy, invasive procedures, and worst of all, the false hopes. We had 2 failed attempts before the third one, and each time it didn't work, I felt like a part of me broke a little more. Gregory was incredible through all of this. There are men who pull away when things get tough, but he was there at every appointment, every injection, every middle of the night cry when I thought it was never going to happen. My parents were also supportive, although I have to admit that sometimes my mom Sharon would say things like, "Just relax and it'll happen," which drove me crazy because obviously that's not how it works. Amber, during all this time, was in her own world, honestly. She had a boyfriend, Connor, who seemed like a good guy, and she worked in marketing or something like that. It's not that she was mean or insensitive about what Gregory and I were going through, but she didn't exactly show much empathy either. Everything always came back to being about her somehow. So we got to the third IVF attempt. By that point, I was already mentally prepared for it to fail again because I didn't want to get my hopes up. But 2 weeks after the procedure, I had my blood test, and the doctor called with the results. I was pregnant. I literally went into shock, like I couldn't process the information. Gregory was at work and I called him crying, and he thought it was bad news until I managed to tell him that no, it had finally worked. It was one of those moments you never forget, you know? That relief, mixed with joy, mixed with fear that something could go wrong. The first few months we were super cautious. We didn't want to tell anyone until we were sure everything was going well, because we'd already been through the experience of telling people and then having to give bad news. But when I hit 12 weeks and the doctor said everything looked perfect, we decided to start sharing the news. We told my parents first, obviously, and they were over the moon. My mom cried. My dad hugged me like he hadn't since I was a kid. We asked them not to tell anyone yet because we wanted to share it at our own pace. This is where everything started to go to hell. About 2 weeks after telling my parents, my cousin Emily, who's the daughter of my mom's sister, threw a party to announce her engagement. It was at a nice restaurant. There were like 30 people. And honestly, I didn't really feel like going because I was still in that first trimester where you feel tired and nauseous all the time. But Gregory said it would be weird not to show up. Amber was also there with Connor, and for most of the night everything was normal. Emily was super happy showing off her ring, talking about wedding plans, all the typical stuff. At one point, I was in a corner of the room talking with my mom, and she asked me how I was feeling, if the nausea had improved, that kind of thing. We were talking quietly, you know. It wasn't like we were shouting about the pregnancy in the middle of someone else's party, but apparently we weren't discreet enough, because I later found out that Amber had overheard us. At the moment, I didn't notice anything weird, but Amber left the party early saying she had a headache, and Connor stayed a while longer because apparently she told him to Uber home later. 2 days later, I think it was a Tuesday, Amber showed up at my house unannounced. I was working from home that day, and when I opened the door, she stormed in. Like, didn't even say hello. She started yelling at me about how dare I be pregnant right when she was about to get engaged to Connor. I was completely shocked because, first, what did one thing have to do with the other? And second, she wasn't even officially engaged. Like, Connor hadn't proposed to her yet, as far as I knew. I asked her what she was talking about, and she said I always had to steal her moment, that I always had to be the center of attention, that I had waited 3 years to get pregnant specifically to ruin her life. The logic made no sense whatsoever. Obviously. But she was completely hysterical. I tried to explain to her that I hadn't even publicly announced the pregnancy, that no one but our parents knew, that she'd only found out by accident, but she wouldn't let me speak. She kept yelling that I was selfish, that I'd always been our parents' favorite, which is ridiculous considering they'd always given her everything she asked for, that my pregnancy was going to ruin all her plans. Gregory was at work and I was alone with her, and honestly, I started getting a little scared because I'd never seen her so out of control. I finally got her to leave by telling her she needed to calm down and that we could talk when she was more relaxed. She left in a rage, slamming the door so hard, the neighbors probably heard it. I sent Gregory a message, telling him what had happened, and he was furious. Like, he told me if she showed up again like that not to open the door. I also told my mom because I thought she could talk to Amber and calm her down. My mom said she'd talk to her, but that probably Amber was just processing the news and it would pass. Emily, my cousin, invited us all to a dinner at my parents' house to keep celebrating her engagement, like a more intimate thing with close family. I really didn't want to go after what had happened with Amber, but Gregory said we couldn't let her dictate our life, and besides, my parents would be there. We went, and at first everything seemed fine. Amber was there with Connor and she greeted me normally, as if nothing had happened. I thought maybe she'd reflected, and everything was okay. During dinner, I was talking with my mom in the kitchen about the pregnancy, again in private, just the two of us. I was telling her we had our first anatomy ultrasound scheduled for the following week, and we were excited to find out the baby's sex. My mom was putting away some dishes and I was sitting on one of the kitchen stools. I didn't realize Amber had come in and was listening to us from the hallway until she exploded again. This time was worse than the first. She started yelling at me in front of everyone that I was trying to steal Emily's moment. How dare I be talking about my pregnancy at someone else's engagement party? That I was a narcissist who always needed attention. Emily and the others came running from the living room to the dining room when they heard the screaming, and Gregory tried to calm Amber down, but she pushed him. My dad, Kenneth, also tried to intervene, telling her she was behaving irrationally, but she wouldn't listen to anyone. Then something happened that I still can't believe when I think about it. Amber grabbed my arm, pulled me toward the hallway, and pushed me toward the basement door. My parents' house is old and has this kind of creepy basement we used to go down to as kids to look for Christmas decorations and stuff. She opened the basement door, pushed me inside, and locked the door from the outside. I was in total shock, like I literally couldn't process that. My sister had just locked me in a basement. I started banging on the door, yelling for her to let me out, and I could hear Gregory and my dad on the other side also yelling at Amber to open the door immediately. She was screaming incoherent things about how I needed to learn a lesson, that she wasn't going to let me ruin her life. The basement door is one of those old solid wood ones with a metal latch that can only be opened from the outside. And no matter how much I pushed, it wouldn't budge. The basement stairs are steep and wooden, and honestly, they were kind of rotten in some parts. I kept banging on the door, and Gregory was trying to force it from the outside. I could hear my mom crying, my dad yelling at Amber. At some point, I don't know exactly how it happened, I lost my balance at the top of the stairs and fell. I rolled down like 3 or 4 steps before I managed to grab the railing, but the impact was hard. Everything hurt, especially my back and stomach, and all I could think about was the baby. I started screaming that I was hurt, that I was pregnant, that someone opened the door now. Apparently, my dad ended up kicking the door until he broke the frame because there was no way Amber was giving up the key. Gregory ran down the stairs and found me on the floor crying hysterically. He helped me up and checked me to see if I was bleeding or anything. There was no visible blood, but I was terrified. Something had happened to the baby. Gregory carried me upstairs, and the next thing I remember is we were in the car heading to the hospital, him driving like crazy while I called my doctor. In the ER, they did an emergency ultrasound and checked everything. The baby was fine, the heartbeat was strong, There were no signs of placental abruption or anything like that. The doctor said I'd been very lucky, that a fall like that in the first trimester could have easily caused a miscarriage. They kept me under observation for like 4 hours to make sure I didn't start having contractions or bleeding. And during all that time, I was between relief that the baby was okay and absolute fury that my sister had put me in that situation. Gregory was beside himself. He called my parents from the hospital and told them that if Amber didn't face real consequences for what she'd done, we would cut contact with the whole family. My parents came to the hospital completely distraught. My mom wouldn't stop crying and apologizing. My dad was pale and in shock. They told me Amber had left the house after what happened, that Connor had taken her away because she was having a panic attack or something. The next day, my parents went to Amber's house to confront her. She apparently told them it had all been an accident, that she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she just wanted me to reflect on my behavior but didn't think I was going to fall. My parents told her that her behavior was unacceptable and dangerous, and that as a consequence they were cutting all the financial support they'd promised her for her wedding to Connor. Important context. Connor had proposed to Amber literally 2 days before the dinner where the basement thing happened, and my parents had promised to pay for their wedding and part of the honeymoon, which, according to Amber, was going to be in Europe and cost like $30,000 or something. Ridiculous like that. Amber completely lost it when my parents told her they weren't going to pay for anything anymore. She yelled at them that they were traitors, that I had manipulated them, that they'd always loved me more. Connor apparently tried to calm her down, but she told him to fuck off too. My parents left there feeling awful but knowing they'd done the right thing. For the next 2 weeks, everything was relatively quiet. Amber didn't contact us, and we definitely didn't try to contact her. I was focused on recovering from the scare and preparing for the next doctor's appointment, but then messages and calls started coming, from relatives and friends asking if it was true that I'd faked a medical emergency for attention. At first, I didn't understand what they were talking about until my aunt, Emily's mom, told me Amber had been telling everyone that I'd exaggerated the fall on purpose to get my parents to punish Amber. Basically, Amber had created this complete narrative where I was a manipulator who'd used my pregnancy to steal the spotlight, and when she kindly confronted me, I'd thrown myself down the stairs on purpose to make her look bad. She said the doctors hadn't found anything wrong with me, that the baby was never in danger, that it had all been an act. She even told some relatives I wasn't really pregnant, that I'd probably faked the tests. Gregory wanted to sue her for defamation, but our lawyer said it would be hard to prove damages and honestly wasn't worth the additional stress. My parents tried to control the rumors by talking to family and explaining what had really happened. But you know how people are. Some prefer to believe the dramatic gossip over the boring truth. What happened next was even worse. About a week later, on a Saturday morning, Amber showed up at our house again. Gregory and I were having breakfast and we heard someone knocking on the door insistently. Gregory went to see who it was, and when he saw it was Amber, he told me to stay inside while he talked to her. But Amber pushed him to get in. Literally pushed him. And came into the house yelling my name. I came out of the kitchen and found her in the living room, and she had this look in her eyes that honestly gave me chills. She was holding the picture frame where Gregory and I had our first ultrasound photo, the one they give you at 12 weeks where the baby still looks like a bean. She grabbed it and threw it to the floor so hard the glass shattered. Then she started stomping on the photo, screaming that she hoped I would lose the baby, that I deserved it for being a selfish bitch, that she hoped I suffered as much as she was suffering. Gregory grabbed her arm to get her out of the house and she tried to scratch him. I called the police while this was happening because this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was harassment and illegal entry to private property. The police arrived in about 10 minutes, but by then Gregory had already managed to get Amber out of the house and lock the door. She was outside banging on the door and windows, completely out of control. The cops talked to her and she told them she was my sister and had just come to talk, that we were the ones exaggerating. We showed them the broken picture frame and explained the history of what had happened. The cops told Amber she had to leave and that if she came back we could request a restraining order. Connor showed up about 20 minutes later to pick up Amber. He apologized to us saying she hadn't been herself lately, that she was in therapy, which was a lie, we found out later, and that he'd make sure she didn't come back. Gregory told him that if he really wanted to help Amber, he needed to stop making excuses for her behavior and get her real help because this wasn't normal anymore. After that incident, we decided to install security cameras in the house and change the locks even though Amber had never had keys. We also seriously considered the restraining order, but our lawyer told us we needed more documented incidents for a judge to approve it. So basically, we had to wait for Amber to do something else before we could legally protect ourselves. Which is crazy if you think about it. For the next few weeks, Amber didn't show up physically, but started a campaign on social media. She'd post vague things about toxic family and manipulative sisters without mentioning me by name, but obviously everyone knew who she was talking about. She also sent several text messages to my mom saying that if they kept supporting me, they were going to lose their other daughter forever. My mom didn't know what to do anymore. Honestly, on one hand, she knew Amber was acting badly, but on the other hand, she was still her daughter and she didn't want to lose her completely. One day, Connor called Gregory. He told him that he and Amber had broken up, that he couldn't continue with someone who refused to seek professional help and who was obsessed with destroying her own family. Apparently, Amber's obsession with me and the baby had gotten to the point where it was all she talked about. Connor said he'd tried to convince her to go to therapy, to take medication, to do something to manage what were clearly serious mental health issues, but she refused and accused him of being on my side. After Connor broke up with her, Amber got worse. She went to my parents' house, not to confront them, but to destroy my old room. My parents had kept my childhood room more or less intact, with some of my old stuff, photos, mementos. Amber went in there and destroyed everything. She broke picture frames, tore my old clothes that were still in the closet, scratched the walls with a permanent marker writing horrible things about me. My parents came home. They'd been out shopping, and found her there in the middle of the disaster, crying hysterically. Kenneth and Sharon called me crying too. They said they didn't recognize Amber anymore, that they didn't know what to do, that they were afraid of their own daughter. I suggested they talk to mental health professionals about how to handle the situation, but the problem is, if Amber didn't want help, no one could force her unless she was an immediate danger to herself or others. And while her behavior was obviously concerning, she hadn't done anything that technically qualified for involuntary commitment. My parents decided to establish limited contact with Amber. They told her she wasn't welcome in their house until she sought professional help and showed them she was working on her problems. They also apologized to me for not having established firmer boundaries with her when we were younger. They said they realized they'd created a monster by never making her accountable for her actions. And while I appreciated the apology, honestly, it was too late to change the past. The time came to give birth. I was 37 weeks when I went into labor, so technically a little premature but within normal range. Gregory and I went to the hospital, and after about 14 hours of labor, I gave birth to a beautiful, healthy baby. It was a boy. He weighed almost 3 kilos, and when I saw him for the first time, I started crying from pure happiness and relief that after everything we'd been through, he was finally here and he was okay. My parents came to the hospital to meet him. Also Gregory's mom, who lived in another state and had come especially for this. We didn't tell anyone else I was in labor. Specifically, we didn't want Amber to find out. We spent 3 days in the hospital and everything was perfect. Like really one of the best moments of my life after so much drama. We got home with the baby and started adapting to life as new parents, which is exhausting but incredible. We posted some photos on social media because we weren't going to hide our son out of fear of Amber, but we blocked Amber and anyone we thought might show her the photos. For the first 2 weeks, everything was quiet, and I started to think maybe we were finally going to have peace. But then strange text messages started arriving on my phone. They were from a number I didn't recognize. And they said things like, "Such small babies are so fragile," and "I hope nothing bad happens to your little boy," and "It would be terrible if something happened to him while he sleeps." Obviously, I knew. It was Amber, even though the number was different. I showed the messages to Gregory and he wanted to go directly to confront her, but I told him we first had to document everything and talk to the police. We went to the police station with all the messages, printed out, and all the documentation of previous incidents. The officer who attended us said it was enough to request a restraining order and helped us fill out the paperwork. He also suggested we consider installing more security measures in the house and to never leave the baby alone where Amber could access him. But Amber didn't stop with the text messages. A week later, my mother-in-law, Gregory's mom, received an anonymous letter at her house in another state. The letter said I was an unfit mother, that I was negligent with the baby, that there was a history of child abuse in my family, completely false, and that someone needed to call Child Protective Services before something happened to the baby. The letter came with photos of me that Amber had taken from social media from years ago, where I was at parties drinking alcohol, as evidence that I was an alcoholic or something. My mother-in-law obviously didn't believe any of that, and called us immediately to let us know. But A fact that Amber had found Gregory's mom's address, who lives in another state and whom Amber had never met, was terrifying. It meant she was investigating, looking for any way to hurt us. Gregory was absolutely furious, like angrier than I'd seen him in our entire relationship. He said this had to end, that we couldn't raise our son in an environment where we were constantly looking over our shoulder. We had a serious conversation about what to do. Gregory suggested we move to his home state, where his family lives. He could transfer with his job. He's a software engineer and his company has offices in several states, and I could technically work remote or find something new. The idea was to physically distance ourselves from Amber, start over in a place where she couldn't show up at our door without planning it. I was devastated with the idea of leaving my parents, especially after everything we'd gone through to have this baby, and they were so excited to be grandparents. But I also knew Gregory was right, that as long as we were near Amber, we were never going to have peace. I talked to my parents about the idea, and they, though sad, understood completely. My mom even said they'd considered moving too, because they didn't feel safe anymore knowing Amber could show up at any moment. Gregory and I made the decision. We started looking for houses in his home state. He arranged the transfer with his job. I started looking for remote jobs. All this while we had a baby less than 2 months old, so the timing couldn't be worse, but we didn't feel we had a choice. We told very few people we were moving. Specifically, we didn't want Amber to find out until we were physically in another state. While we were making preparations for the move, Amber had another breakdown. Connor, her ex, called us one night saying Amber had shown up at his house at 2 a.m, banging on the door and screaming. He'd requested a restraining order after they broke up because she wouldn't stop harassing him, and by showing up at his house, Amber was violating that order. Connor called the police and Amber was arrested. She spent the night in jail and my parents had to go get her out the next morning. She had charges for violating the restraining order and for disturbing the peace. Kenneth and Sharon said when they picked her up she was completely broken, crying and saying her life was ruined, that everyone had abandoned her, that it was my fault. They tried to talk to her about seeking help, but she just yelled incoherently. The judge in her case ordered mandatory psychiatric evaluation and probation, which was a relief because it meant she was finally going to have some kind of professional supervision. But by that point, we already had the move scheduled for 2 weeks later. We packed our entire life into boxes, sold some furniture that wasn't worth transporting, and prepared to start over. The day of the move, my parents came to say goodbye. It was horrible, honestly, seeing my mom crying while holding her grandson knowing she'd now only see him on holidays or occasional visits. My dad tried to stay strong, but his voice was breaking too. I promised them we'd come visit often and that they'd always be welcome in our new home. I also told them it wasn't their fault, that they'd done everything they could with Amber, but sometimes people just don't want help. We drove about 12 hours to Gregory's state with the baby in his car seat in the back. It was exhausting but also liberating in a way. Like with every kilometer we moved away from Amber, I could breathe a little easier. We arrived at our new house, which we'd rented without even seeing it in person, except through photos, and started unpacking and building our new life. It's been 6 months since the move now. Amber doesn't know where we live. We told my parents not to tell her even if she asked, which according to them she hasn't. According to my mom, Amber is in court-mandated therapy and apparently taking medication, but they don't have much contact with her. Amber sends them occasional messages, but never asks about me or the baby, as if we'd ceased to exist for her. My son is almost 8 months old now, and he's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Gregory got a promotion at his job. I found a remote position I love, and we're close to Gregory's family who've welcomed us with open arms. Gregory's parents are incredible grandparents, and they're excited to have the baby nearby. My parents visit us every 2 months or so, and we went back to my home state once. But we stayed in a hotel and didn't tell anyone else we were there. Sometimes I think about Amber and wonder if she'll ever really get better. If someday we'll be able to have some kind of relationship. But honestly, after everything that happened, I don't think that's possible. She crossed too many lines, endangered my baby, and destroyed any trust that could have existed between us. Maybe that makes me a bad sister, I don't know. But my priority is my son and my husband, and if protecting them means cutting contact with my blood sister, then that's what I have to do. The hardest part is the guilt I sometimes feel. Guilt for moving away from my parents, guilt for not being able to fix Amber, guilt for feeling relief that she's out of our lives. My mom tells me it's not my fault, that I did everything I could, but the feeling is still there. Gregory reminds me that we didn't cause Amber's problems, that she made her own choices, that we're just protecting ourselves. I guess he's right. But it's still complicated to process all of this. What I do know is that our life now is peaceful in a way it wasn't before. I'm not constantly worried that Amber will show up. I don't have to check my phone afraid of finding threatening messages. I don't have to explain to people why my sister hates me. It's like we can finally just exist and be a normal family, which after 3 years of fertility, treatments, and almost a year of drama with Amber, feels like a huge gift. My son isn't going to know his Aunt Amber, at least not while he's little. Maybe someday, when he's older, we'll tell him about her, about what happened. But for now, he only knows his grandparents, his uncles on Gregory's side, and the people who really love him and want the best for him. And honestly, that's enough.